My name is Kristen Haussmanns, and I'm the manager of lectures, courses, and concerts. It's my honor to welcome you to today's talk, Cassatt's Formation, Forging a Path as a Woman in a Man's World. Elliot Bostwick Davis, John Moore's Cabot Chair of the Art of the Americas Department at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston since January 2001, came to the MFA from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. In her position as chair of the MFA's Art of the Americas Department, Davis oversees the museum's extensive collection of art from North, Central, and South America, including one of the world's preeminent collections of American paintings, decorative arts, and sculpture. Her responsibilities include leading curatorial staff in the planning of the galleries for the new Art of the Americas wing, which opened in November of 2010, and was the recipient of the annual Exposition Prize, honoring the Outstanding Permanent Collection Installation of 2010 from the Association of Art Museum Curators. She also orchestrates important acquisitions and exhibitions, working with all of the museum's varied constituents, and researches the Art of America's collections. Please join me in welcoming Elliot Bostwick Davis.
Thank you, Kristen and Rick, who's up helping us with all the slides, and everyone who's turned out today to hear about Cassatt. It's really tremendous. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you to speak about a subject that's very close to my heart. And I'm absolutely so thrilled to see that we're really sold out, because our new director, Matthew Teitelbaum, asked Erica and me and some others in our department, Erica Herschel, who will be in this course as well, as you know, and is joining us today, I'm thrilled to say, about whether our public would be interested in engaging in different topics about women artists and gender. And I think we both said yes, and look at all of you. So this is great. But my own interest in entering graduate school in art and archaeology had been largely driven by many of the stories I had heard about Cassatt, who had been a close member of our family. But today, it is a very special day for me because we're inaugurating this course focusing on the work of Mary Cassatt, a distinguished and very important 19th century American artist, early 20th century, as well as a woman artist. And the course is funded by a very important to us female philanthropist, Ozzy Dejani, also a very dear friend, a gallery instructor, and I don't know if you know it, but we also get out on that squash court together, and thanks to Ozzy pulling me out there for the Mass States, and we play for fun and have a great time, and we play to win, right, Ozzy? So it's great to have you all here today, and as I said, especially my colleague, Erica Herschel. Erica came in with me, but I didn't see where you went, Erica, but we'll be highlighting some of the things I hope you'll be, or leading up to what you'll be talking about next week. And remember, it is a 4-week course, and I'll be highlighting those other colleagues who will be speaking. Nancy Mole-Matthews, really the leading expert on many things about Cassatt, especially her work on paper, and also Paul Fisher, a professor at Wellesley College, who will be talking with us about Louisine Havemeyer and her work as a suffragette. But my role today in launching the course for all of us is to really provide you with a brief overview of Cassatt's world, and especially those early years for her artistic formation, her efforts to engage with an art world that was at that time, and you know, in many ways still remains largely geared for men, especially in the realm of easel painting, which had been what she had hoped to pursue. So throughout, you'll be touching upon works in art. You'll be seeing works in our collections. I tried to focus on those, as well as those public collections that you'll be able to visit. And I hope throughout you'll get a feel for her work, not just in paintings, but also in pastel and in prints. And I do want to highlight the work of our wonderful intern, Eliza White, a student at at Northeastern, who prepared the handout. And I know you have a few highlights there of Cassatt's chronology there. So, first, to Cassatt's early life. She was born on May 22nd, so her birthday is coming up soon, 1844, in what is now part of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She was the fourth child, the second daughter of Robert and Catherine Cassatt. Their eldest child was a girl who died in infancy, followed by another girl, Lydia, who's going to make an appearance in a moment in some of our slides, and then two sons, Alexander and Robert, Mary, and here she is, you see her on this slide standing in the center of this scene with her father and two brothers. And then she had another younger brother, Joseph Gardner, who was also known as Guard. So here you see her standing with her two older brothers, Robert and Alexander, missing her younger one. And she, at age 10, in this image, I think very much a feature, or must have captivated even Peter Baumgartner, rendering this scene, because she seems to be engaging with him quite directly as the father and son play chess, and the other younger brother also engaging directly. By the age of 5, Cassatt's family had relocated right into the city of Philadelphia on West Chestnut Street. And by 1851, when she was 7, they went abroad, largely seeking treatment for her brother Robert, and he's the one wearing this Scottish costume there, because he had suffered from a very severe bone disease. And sadly, the family would have a lot of illness. In fact, her older sister Lydia suffered from what's known as Bright's disease. So by 1855, they were in Paris that fall. And Robert, then they took him to Germany. Presumably that's when they rendered this scene, soon about that time, and he unfortunately died in Germany. Her older brother Alexander remained abroad. He studied engineering in Darmstadt, and the entire family eventually returned to Philadelphia, where they purchased a house in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is located, sort of nestled between Philadelphia and Wilmington. So while she was in Europe, Cassatt had the opportunity to become fluent in French and German, both very important for her work as an expatriate and a really formidable member of artists working abroad. And before the Cassatt family left Europe to return to the United States in 1855, they would have had an opportunity to visit a very important exhibition in Paris, that is the Universal Exposition of 1855. And it's there where she would have had a chance to see the work of Eugène Delacroix, and as well, outside of the official Universal Exposition, artists like Gustave Courbet, shown here on the screen, and Edouard Manet had established their own pavilions where people could see their work. And I think, interestingly, when you think of artists and you think of their formation, you know, 1855, she's 10, about to be 11. You don't think maybe that's a formative year, but yes, it's actually very formative, and I think that point for me was driven home working recently for the MFA's project on the Jamie Wyeth retrospective. He knew already he wanted to be an artist at a very young age, and had convinced his parents by about the same age Cassatt is seeing this, that he wanted to leave school. So here we are, back to Cassatt, and seeing this enormous, and this really is an enormous painting for those of you who've had a chance to see it at the Musée d'Orsay. It's life-size. You see the full title of it there, and it's very much Courbet painting himself, painting in the midst of his contemporaries of realism at the time. The artist studio, a real allegory. And I think this work, if nothing else, would have been something mesmerizing for her. You see, we could unpack this, probably spend a whole course session just working on this painting. But here he is painting, the young child's looking at him with a cat. Here's the nude model. Nudes were going to be a very important part of her recommendation for building acquisitions with many of her American collectors. He writes about the various people in this painting. On the right half, well, we have lovers here by the window. We have critics, we have Baudelaire reading, and we have his dealer, Bruyas, sort of looking on, his sponsor. And over on the left, he writes about really the aspects of human misery, the everyday life, and I'm just going to see if I can find here what he had to say. On the side of, quote, everyday life, we find a priest, a merchant, a hunter, who somewhat resembles Napoleon III, and even an unemployed worker and a beggar girl, symbolizing poverty, sort of all, here she is, and back in here in this canvas. Well, Cassatt, for her part, as her career was going to go on, was part of a period in French painting where there were many examples of these very large-scale decorative programs. And I just wanted to introduce, along with the Courbet, to keep these in your mind, Puvis de Chavannes there at the top, about the period in which she's going to be embarking on some very large-scale painting for the United States, and our own MFAs, Paul Gauguin. And remember, these central figures in both plucking apples from the tree, because again, how this plays out over the course of Cassatt's life, she, unlike her contemporaries in Paris, Edgar Degas or Camille Pissarro, whom she worked with very closely in the 1870s, 80s, she did embark on a very large mural program, this one, Modern Woman, for the Hall of Honor Exhibition Hall at the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago. And she paired that, it was paired with Mary McMonnies' Primitive Woman. She did Modern Woman. And if you ever see anything resembling these three images, please let us know, because they're now lost. So if you're out looking, or someone says, I'd love you to see what's in my barn, I think it might be a Mary Cassatt, I want you to call me or Erica as soon as possible. So that's to just put in sort of her early formation there. Now, between 1860 and 1862, Cassatt began her formal artistic training at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in the antique class, where she followed the traditional methods of becoming an artist that began with drawing from cast. And this is very much of that era. Those of you will know that when the MFA Boston was founded in 1870, we of course were founded with the school, and we had an entire hall of casts here as well, with the purpose of training artists. So here you see the sketch pads, you see many of the, here are the, the reliefs of the riders of the Parthenon frieze, the Michelangelo slaves, and many of the great, monuments. Here's one of the Laocoon torso that Rubens rendered. Here's the Apollo Belvedere. All of these great monuments of Western art that would have been where she began. And I think also that sense of sculpture really played through her work, and I wanted to remind you of that because I think Luca della Robbia, and again, he'll be the subject of a wonderful upcoming exhibition curated by Marietta Cambareri. I think she always maintained in her work a sense of the sculptural, and we didn't spend time with it, I'm sure, Nancy Matthews and possibly Erica will, but in the Modern Woman frieze, she actually embeds these Madonna and children figures very much inspired by her love of della Robbia. So let us turn back to her formation. During the Civil War, the Cassatt family left Philadelphia. They spent time on their farm, and with a whole generation of artists following the Civil War, Cassatt, among those, sought further training abroad. And I want you to take, while this is on the screen, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what she would have experienced, but really focus in on this bow that she has here. You're going to see that in some of the images. If we had the full length, and I may adjust this for the next session on Thursday, but she's actually holding a fan in this photograph that's closed, and I just want to note that for you. I hadn't realized it was cut off, but that's part of it. Sitting on her lap is her holding a fan, which will also make another appearance. In 1865, Cassatt returned to France with her mother, Catherine, unfortunately having stirred up her father's anger that she intended to become a professional artist. And I think you'll be hearing a lot more about the Paris that Cassatt was entering in Erica's sessions next week. So today I really just want to touch upon some of those aspects of her formation. So first and foremost, when she arrived in Paris, she had access to many of the public collections, as well as some of the private or the secular and religious collections that she would have known even from her family's earlier visit, but now would have a chance to study as a professional artist. And as one of the leading Cassatt scholars points out, Griselda Pollock, and her work is on your handout for you today, her parents very much, although they were comfortable members of Philadelphia and society, they did feel, and they had decreed, that her own art practice had to be self-financing. So she was intensely focused on opportunities to gain as much experience as she could as a copyist. And I'm just showing you, these are two of the Winslow Homer wood engravings that he designed for Harper's Weekly that would have been part of his own travels to France in 1867. So at the left there, you see copyists in the Louvre. And I think it's very interesting in the Grand Gallery that he's focusing on the female copyists there. On the right, the French can was, of course, what I think Cassatt's father was, probably a little bit worried about. How is this going to play out for Mary Cassatt, his daughter from Philadelphia? But you see there, kicking up the heels was, quite risque at the time, and Homer loved sending that back to his editors. I guess it was sure to get onto the pages of Harper's Weekly. So, born in 1844, as we said at the outset, Cassatt was exactly contemporaneous with another great painter from Philadelphia, Thomas Eakins, and who had also traveled to France to study with one of the great French masters at the École des Beaux-Arts. Here's Eakins. I'm showing you one in our own collection at the left, one in the Metropolitan's collection that he actually sent various studies to his teacher, Jerome, in Paris to comment upon. And here, here you've got two of the Jeromes in our collection that you can go upstairs into our Evans Wing second floor galleries and take a look at. Now, Cassatt, being a woman, was not able to join the classes at the École des Beaux-Arts, but she managed, according to her American contemporaries, and particularly many women who had hoped to gain access into Jerome's classes, to actually become a student of his. And one of her American friends wrote to Eakins to find out how she managed to do it. How did she manage to be honored by Jerome's private lessons? So ever resourceful and ambitious, she goes further. So she's now had the opportunity to study privately with Jerome, and with an American friend, Eliza Haldeman, she begins other studies in another part of France. With first they visit Charles Chaplin's studio, and then they travel to Eakins to study under two other artists, Frère and Sawyer. But we learn about her outlook from Haldeman. Now, I couldn't find for you, it just tells you a bit about the state of many of these women artists. I couldn't even find a decent slide of anything Haldeman had done for you to see, nor a really good photograph of her, but I'll hope to keep looking. But in any event, we learn a lot about Cassatt from those friends that are writing back to the United States in those years before email, when some of these letters survived. So Haldeman in 1867 writes to her mother about this difference between French and American painters. And she says, "The difference between the Americans and the French are that the former work for money and the latter work for fame," unquote. And that's going to become important and when we see the young girls pursuing fame in her Modern Woman mural. But during those years, Cassatt and Haldeman went to Barbizon to visit Jean-François Millet, and he should have the Sedilla here everywhere, and there. These are all MFA pictures except for, well, they all are actually William Morris Hunt, the American, copying Millet, and we have Millet of the same scene of sheep shearing in Barbizon. And she was very interested in learning about his work, and of course, someone else, her contemporary Homer, had been as well, visiting Barbizon, as did William Morris Hunt. But it's, I think, significant that Millet was equally at home, not just in oil painting, as you see on the two top scenes here, but also in the works on paper, especially pastel, and these are two of his etchings, one of them hand-colored. And again, Cassatt's going to pick up all of these media in full force as she gets moving along in her career. And Cassatt even contemplated studying with Millet. From letters that were written, by her friend Eliza Haldeman, here's what we learn, the following, and I quote from Eliza's letter. "We were in Barbizon last week, but she," that's Cassatt, "was not pleased with the master she intended taking on. You can imagine the horror we were seized with in hearing he painted without models. Of course, he doesn't draw well, and though a very celebrated painter, would not be a good master on that account. He is one of the best of the school of Barbizon and was engaged in painting a fat pig being led to slaughter. The school there is composed entirely of landscape painters, contrary to that of Écureuils, who are all figure and interior painters. Though at the former, they all paint figures and animals out of doors. Mary is very anxious to learn the style, and it is very fine, unquote. So look what happens as we think about Eliza and Mary Cassatt traveling through these two different variations of the Barbizon school, one focusing, as we heard, on people in interiors, which still figures in interiors, and others out of doors. So I brought you here, this is her sister. I mentioned you would meet her in her work. This is her sister Lydia, crocheting in the garden, and on the right you have it juxtaposed with a Millet shepherdess, of course a very different type of woman, a working woman there, but also engaged out of doors in this task of focusing on her handiwork. And again, in interiors, Millet is also going to show women, and we could have picked other similar kinds of Cassatts of women working inside in interiors by candlelight, in this case with a little child right at her, close at hand there. But out of doors, and you see here how Cassatt could easily have adopted these kinds of lessons from Millet or from those artists she encountered in Écureuils. Here, the young girl at a window overlooking the modern city. And here you see a bit of Haussmanns Paris as it was remade in the 19th century with the little dog. And Cassatt always had these small dogs in her family. She's often shown with them. Here's Millet and his shepherdess with a spinning yarn, and again, part of handiwork, so a very different kind of object seated on her lap, sort of part of her world, as opposed to a lap dog that would have been part of the more bourgeois world that Cassatt was portraying in her young girl at a window. And I love thinking about these two, the young mother sewing, in many ways, one of the great icons from the Metropolitan Museum's collection. These are not actually mothers and children, but rather a favorite model of Cassatt's, a woman named Renee Lefevre, who modeled for her quite regularly, appears frequently in her paintings and her pastels and her prints of that period, with a young girl that she's asked to pose as though this were her mother. And here you see on the right Millet's image of this very attentive mother helping her child learn how to knit there. So I think, again, these how artists play out these early lessons of their formation is something that often occurs over many decades, and they often circle back to those subjects that were meaningful to them early on. So I mentioned Winslow Homer had come to Paris in 1867. He actually came that year for about 10 months to see these two paintings of his, and I'm showing one on the right in a color lithograph, so in a print, not in an oil painting, but to see these two at the Universal Exposition in Paris. One was Prisoners from the Front there you see, and on the bright side. And I think as well that Millet had a lot to do with how he's thinking about his own work. Of course, he was born here actually in Cambridge across the river, but worked here in Boston before heading to New York and working for Harper's Weekly. And so already an artist like William Morris Hunt had been bringing back the work of Jean-François Millet to Boston, which is why our collection really is outstanding beyond any other in the United States. So here you have him thinking about the men the African Americans who were part of the Union Army, and yet in this case were not wearing the uniform of the Union Army, so hence are part of the camp scene, but in this case don't have an official role at that moment. Now, in 1867, when Cassatt came back, at the Universal Exposition were these two pavilions, and I think I may have mentioned the one of Courbet and Manet. Only in 1855, it was only Courbet outside the pavilion. I may have mistakenly said Manet was there too. He was actually at this exposition in 1867. So these two artists really become, I think in many ways, pillars for Cassatt's work. and her world. And I wanted to show you a few of them that I think particularly play out in terms of her own work. So here, these would have been known to her. So Gustave Courbet had a very favorite model. Here she is at the left, Jo la Belle Irlandaise, with this beautiful red hair. She also was well known to Whistler and became Whistler's mistress. Here she is in the Symphony in White in the center. And red hair appears, as you know, often in the work of the Pre-Raphaelites. It often suggests a certain sensuality and a certain kind of woman, the red-haired woman. I just brought along her Cassatt, Mary Cassatt's The Mirror, to just show how she's playing off of even these early scenes of the woman looking in the mirror. But it's really the red hair that I wanted to focus on, because the red-haired model also appears quite regularly in the work of Edouard Manet, particularly in that he chose Victorine Meurent as one of his favorite models of the 1860s, and here she is in our own portrait. Cassatt, as her career rolls forward, and the 1891 on the right, this one called Reverie of the Redhead, is again a favorite model of hers, appears quite regularly in all of her, not just the works on, the oils on canvas, but in her works on paper, and even in her inspiration for her modern woman mural. So let's take a look at that. Here are individual paintings of the red-headed woman picking fruit, an older woman there seated at the left looking up at her, and then you see a sort of another version of that, again, as she's thinking through, and these are all works that are being created around the time of the work on the modern mural, modern woman mural. But the red-headed model also appears throughout this series of the 10 color Aqua Tints, and these are just 4 of them. These are works that I spent a good deal of time working on back in the late 90s at the Metropolitan, where there was a set, and we're fortunate here in Boston, there is a set as well. These are highly labor-intensive works to create. They're created by working with a series of impressions to create not just the dry point, but also the color that you see there. This is the red-haired model, and just notice the sort of rhythm that Cassatt's providing you in this series. Each one is an individual print. They're each about this big. They're occasionally on view. They were on view when our wing opened in 2010. She's showing the model from the back, but reflected in the mirror from the front, in a sort of semi-public space of the dressing room of the seamstress's dressing room, and then in a private space, presumably, or you could think of it possibly as semi-public in that it's her drawing room there. So this is the red-haired model, often shown also in that aspect of sensuality that I mentioned, exposing the nape of her neck. And this was something that I suspect, not maybe Erica and also Nancy Matthews will be discussing more, Cassatt's relationship to Japanisme and Japanese prints. And in fact, in the Japanese prints that she so admired that were shown in Paris at a major exhibition in 1890, she just remarked how she could dream of nothing else but color on copper, and hence produced these works in 25 impressions each, which is unheard of. So they really are, in many ways, not just a high watermark for any printmaking ever produced by American artists, but in her case, completely unique, and I don't want to underestimate their importance. The red-haired young woman also makes an appearance in this study, the pastel in the museum's collection. Here she's younger, and the dark-haired model with her is showing her and instructing her in the banjo. And if we took a look at some of the Japanese prints by Utamaro and others, we would know that the Japanese prints often show the sitar being taught to a younger woman as part of her training to become part of the floating world's realm of courtesans, highly women who were part of the pleasure world of the Edo period. And here you see their heads very close together, again, a trope or a way to present two women that Cassatt uses quite frequently in her work, and we're going to see that appear again and again. So also at this exhibition, we're going back to what kinds of things would have been part of her world. In 1867, in this very individualized pavilion that these two artists who didn't want to be part of the formal installation of the Universal Exposition said they were independent artists, so they were going to have their own work. Manet showed Olympia, and this is again Victorine Morand, the redheaded model, with her African-American servant here, presenting her with a bouquet, presumably from one of her admirers of perhaps the evening before. And I think I wanted you to know that Cassatt herself, although she destroyed a tremendous amount of her early work, so it's hard for us to really know much about this early period. But this sketch of someone called Mrs. Curry does survive, and I do think it plays off of her experience with Manet's great Olympia. And I just note here, here's her reuse of the canvas. You see upside down the portrait of Mr. Cassatt that she's painted over to show the African-American model here, Mrs. Curry. So we'll have to find out a little bit more about her. But she is illustrated. In your handout, you have the catalog that Judy Barter and Erica and others, George Shackelford, put together for the Cassatt exhibition retrospective that was here at the museum in 1998 and also at the Metropolitan when I was working there in 1998 as well. Well, Manet and Courbet were great colleagues and certainly high watermarks for Cassatt. And I just wanted to show another way that her work plays out against these great, great giants. So here you have Courbet's Woman with the Parrot. And that's, again, probably inspired by Jo Irlandaise, looks very similar to her as she's strewn out there. The parrot was also a symbol of sensuality. You see Manet taking a different version of it in that he's showing a woman in a peignoir and a dressing gown, and now the bird is much more of sort of a trained type of parrot of that year of sort of call and response. And when Cassatt turns to the theme in 1891, when she's deeply engaged in her work on copper, and here are the dry points, that means that they're drawn directly on the plate with no using a surface cover, but it means you actually have to scrape into the plate. It's, as she would say, an unforgiving medium in that every line you make is then there as though you're sketching in ink. So she's using Mathilde, her very loyal maid who worked for her, and she's showing Mathilde there kind of speaking with a parrot. And here she's got the French for a trial proof there for this dry point, but you could only make about more than 20 impressions, maybe 25, and you've already then really brought the drawing down to what they would say the burr of the dry point would be then worn down and they would be not usable. But just to keep in mind how these three are going to take on subjects very differently. She's responding to this world of her male colleagues, and yet she is presenting the theme in her own work in perhaps a more refined way, or one she felt that was open to her in the work that she was doing. I love thinking about these two works because they're in our collection. Manet's The Street Singer, which came to our museum with the help of another woman artist, Sarah Choate Sears. And this Cassatt, one of the cornerstones of our collection, I'm sure you'll be seeing it again and again throughout this course. I certainly hope you will. But I think what is hard for us today as 21st century viewers in 2016 is to think about how radical this would have seemed at the time. So in the case of The Street Singer, the fact that Manet is capturing this woman as she's presumably leaving her concert, she's coming out through, she would have been singing on the street, but maybe had gone into a cafe to get some sustenance, and she's got these cherries in a piece of wrapping paper that she's taking away with her. You see her guitar sort of casually held there and the cherries in the crook of her arm, but she's holding up the cherries to her mouth, covering it there, and therefore not allowing us access to one of the most expressive features of any portrait, which is really the mouth. Yet she's gazing directly at us. Now, again, it's part of this moment where French avant-garde artists are aware of photography and this sense of the ephemeral being captured on film, and particularly in photography, something of great interest to her compatriot, her fellow artist, Edgar Degas, whom we're going to meet in a moment. But here in the case of Manet, that ephemeral gesture, look at how Cassatt's going to capture it in the tea. She's going to use the cup in that sense of ephemeral gesture so that we just see over the tip of the rim at the young woman's eyes, and they're very close together. And of course, we own at the MFA Boston this very set, this silver tea set. It's often in the gallery with the painting. And here you see how she's using that upside down, sort of not allowing you to see the mouth. And again, I think there are lots of ways to interpret this over time, because is she presenting it as a way to block the male gaze, or is she thinking about this as a woman artist as something that reflects for her a new way of painting? And I think we can keep thinking about those questions. Fans, of course, would have done this quite regularly, and she was well familiar with fans, not only through her knowledge of Japanese prints, but also through the avant-garde painters in Paris, Manet, Edgar Degas, others, Monet. And so she uses the fan in many different ways, and I just brought along these three to suggest some of the ways that she's going to use the fan. So like artists like Pissarro and Degas, she's quite interested in the formal shape of the fan. Degas and Cassatt as well actually painted on these fan shapes, and again, artists often change the shape of their surfaces to really kind of shake up their work or to just give them new perspectives on how they're working. Here in the most really active modern woman, of the woman in the opera loge, or the holding her fan closed as she's doing the looking with the opera glasses, while a man across the ring there is looking at her. And yet the reason I'm going to, when I revise for Thursday, present the image of her we saw in 1867 with the closed fan, is I think for her, this is a very active woman. If the fan is closed, I might suggest here that we could take that on as a possibility of an interpretation, but certainly in this composition it seems to suggest that. And she very frequently loves playing off, as does Degas, the shape of the open and unfurled fan. And again, here it's blocking on these two very virginal young ladies who are presumably there in the opera box, a little bit like debutantes to be seen. And yet one holding beautiful flowers, but one, again, covering her mouth with the fan. So this is part of that aspect of seduction that I think Cassatt was certainly well aware of in Japanese prints, flirtation, or blocking that very expressive feature of the female face, the mouth itself. So again, as we go through the course, for those of you who are staying for all 4 of our weeks, I hope you'll, for yourselves, assess how Cassatt may use this very familiar object of women's couture and sort of accoutrement in different ways to signal different modes, let's say. Now, back to her story of her own formation, and here we are with Manet. She did also become very interested in studying with Couture, who was Manet's teacher as well. And I show you here, because you can go over and look at it at the Harvard Art Museums, the Romans of the Decadence, and I love the way now it's installed with many of their classical sculpture there. And here, just to know that, of course, Manet was a good student also, and he's carefully studying his own teacher when he's thinking about presenting Olympia to us on all of those brilliant white sheets. And again, this is one, I think, very much a part of Cassatt's formation, and interesting in revealing in how perhaps much more bold she is in her early work, and she really pulls it back, I think, as time goes on. So here we have, this is painted after the Exposition of 1867, but it appeared in the salon of the Paris Salon of 1869. And in this image of the balcony, in Manet's balcony, he is posing his sister-in-law, another close colleague of Mary Cassatt's, Berthe Morisot, married to Manet's brother Eugène. And you see her with the closed fan leaning on the rail, and then this figure adjusting her gloves, again, that sort of ephemeral gesture, looking a bit Japonesque there. I mean, not quite clear, and the man sort of from the background as these two are being presented. Now, this is Cassatt. If we think of her call and response to this, it's called a flirtation. And it's certainly much more obviously flirtatious. These women were presenting themselves on the balcony, and guess what? You see the fan open there, and the woman actually fanning herself there on the balcony, and they're presumably looking down perhaps at the carnival passing below, which we're also going to see in a moment. So again, she's very much thinking about how she can present these scenes of modern life, because the balcony was a space made available in the Paris that Haussmann had created, where you could be part of this semi-public, semi-private space, sort of introduce yourself to the world from the privacy of your home. Also in the Salon of 1869, and here we meet her really most important contemporary and collaborator, Edgar Degas. In that salon, Degas showed this work, the portrait of Joséphine Gauguin, and it's across the street at the Gardner Museum. A very interesting and, I think, serious early portrait by Degas. This was a dancer, presumably he knew well, and I think that seriousness of his portrayal of another artist, effectively, if you will, another dancer, performer, is captured in some of these images by Cassatt of, in this case, her mother, quite seriously focused on reading the newspaper, Le Figaro, the French newspaper, title there, quite, you could certainly see Le Figue, so you knew it was Le Figaro. And with the mirror, again, a feature you often see in the avant-garde work of the French artists, playing off of reflection, light, and space as they work through all these different aspects of modern painting. And yet it's that sense of seriousness, I think, that resonated for me in wondering how that really played out for Cassatt in seeing this work by Degas early on at the Salon of 1869. Here's another one later on. You saw this earlier, but I think, again, that reflective woman, the thinking woman, here not with a newspaper, but you have a sense in the case of these portraits that there's a lot going on in their interior life. Also in that, would have been in that salon, but actually he thought better of it, and I just mention it because, again, it's part of our collection here, was the execution of Emperor Maximilian. Manet thought he could perhaps present this to the official salon, and his colleagues advised him not to, so he withdrew it. Fortunately, we have it here. So again, something to think about as far as that edge of what was acceptable and what would have been part of the world in which she is so anxious to be a part of as a practicing artist. And again, she had to fulfill that, knowing her parents' wishes. So during after 1869, France and Europe is thrown into the Franco-Prussian War. She returns. Before she goes back home because of the war, she travels to Rome, and unfortunately she stays there, fortunately for her, for 6 months, but unfortunately for us as art historians, we don't have anything that survives of that period, and that's what's often hard as we piece together artists' early life. But back in the United States, she joins artists she had known from her life in Paris, Eakins, and also Haldeman. And then she finds a way, and this is the interesting aspect of Cassatt. She's incredibly resourceful. She finds a way to return to Europe. She's now on a mission from the Catholic Archbishop of Pittsburgh, which, if you recall, had been her birthplace. And he commissioned Cassatt to produce copies of old masters that were most admired during the 19th century. The Archbishop was Spanish, And Spanish painting happened to be one of her most favored modes of painting at that time. So I think she also strategically sought out the Archbishop because he was able to offer her letters of introduction to the bishops of Spain, who could then get her into various Spanish collections, which had been really one of her obsessions. So again, very strategic, very focused, and also must have been very charming to get all of these opportunities as a woman. At that time, and so here we see her, we're going to meet her again, but this is a photograph that was taken at about that time, just a little bit later in Parma. And her new traveling companion when she returns after the Franco-Prussian War is a young artist named Emily Sartain, whose father had been a printmaker, also from Philadelphia, and was, Cassatt certainly knew in her circle. And let's take a look at, here's Emily Sartain a little bit later on. And this, again, was one of the only really good slides I could find online of her work. And I don't even know, unfortunately, it's not even attributed to any collection, but I think you can see Emily Sartain. Look what she's got there, folks. The fan a little bit halfway open, so have to think about that. But I think a self-portrait are certainly inspired, it looks to me, by her own study of her own face. So they travel together, and I think they spend time in Spain, and here now you see Cassatt really delving into these Spanish subjects. So there you have at the left, Edouard Manet. This is Victorine Meurent. I think we could think of her as a 19th century Caitlyn Jenner, perhaps. She's dressed as an espada, meaning she's dressed as a male bullfighter. Maybe we think of her as she's certainly cross-dressing there. And here is Cassatt thinking about the Toreador and the woman offering him Panal, a drink, but again, very flirtatious, I think, much more flirtatious than we think of Cassatt as her portraits and her genre scenes play out over the course of her career. But here's this one early on, and it's nearby. You can go see it out at the Clark Museum. And here she is after the bullfight, the Toreador lighting a cigarette. And just in case you mistaken, well, this is also part of this ephemeral quality of an artist painting fire and smoke is something that, of course, like the steam of the Gare Saint-Lazare that was of such great interest to Monet, steam, smoke, and flames are all like water, quite ephemeral. They're always in movement. They're one of those artists' challenges to portray. So here, the lighted cigarette of the Toreador is a certain artistic challenge to Cassatt, a sort of gauntlet, if you will. And if you mistaken that the cigarette has this flirtatious and sexual connotation, I think just look across the way at the John Singer Sargent, the sulfur match of a later period, and this one of the same sort of mode of those over at the gardener at El Jaleo, probably, who knows, this may be the dancer herself leaning up against this wall as the sulfur match is lighting there that cigarette for the man with her. So I've always felt this is probably also some kind of, in Sargent's case, tribute to Carmen, the opera Carmen, since he loved music so much, and of course Carmen is the quintessential seductress of what else but a cigarette factory. So as they travel around, in addition to visiting Madrid and Seville, they land in Parma, where that photograph was taken of Cassatt, and there she does make those copies for the Archbishop of Pittsburgh, of artists like Correggio. Now, many, of course, religious works were wanted in his repertoire, and she was being paid for these. So she was paying her way to get around Europe and study the old masters. It was a very successful strategy on her part. And I think you see it playing out in her later work. Here you see the mother and child, Madonna and Christ, and possibly Mary Magdalene, and here you see how she's going to portray them. And Degas actually referred to the painting on the right as this would be Christ, the baby Jesus with his English nurse, was how he referred to it. But he got the point that it was very much, I think embedded in that, is that it was very much a Madonna and child. Now, for her own part, now she's very anxious to get into the salon herself. Together, they spent that time in Parma in 1872, and they hit all the great cities. They also visited Holland and Belgium, which will be important. They went back to Paris and Rome and the French countryside, and finally landed in Paris again in 1875, where Cassatt rented a studio on the Rue de Laval there in Paris. And in 1872, the year of this painting, that is the first time that Cassatt's work was accepted by the Paris Salon. And it was this painting during Carnival that you see at the left, and I'm just showing it with a Courbet, the lovers in the country, that it has been compared with. And you'll see throughout, and I think you've already got a feel for the fact that Cassatt is showing these very interlocked faces often for emotional impact in the way she's juxtaposing them. But in this particular case of the painting of During Carnival, it may have also, Cassatt may have hit upon it because she felt that it perhaps would have resonated even more with her American audience, because none other than Nathaniel Hawthorne, in his work, which was well known to Americans traveling abroad and those here in the United States who were literate, the marble faun actually described this particular custom that was going on, that was part of the carnival season in Rome. And here I'm just going to read for a moment to you from Hawthorne, and I quote, "Often the lover in the Corso may thus have received from his bright mistress in her father's princely balcony the first sweet intimation that his passionate glances had not been struck against a heart of marble. What more appropriate model of suggesting her tender secret could a maiden find than by the soft hit of a rosebud against a young man's cheek?" Unquote. So you see there the two women, and guess who's got, well, maybe not a rosebud, but certainly some flowers, and you see her, the reddish hair again, sort of leaning behind her more European counterpart there, or European-looking counterpart with the décolletage. So interpreting Cassatt's image in terms of Hawthorne's well-known story of the marble faun, we could see the fair American, as Hawthorne described there at the left, tossing her flowers or her rosebud, as the exotic dark-haired woman, essentially the one in Hawthorne was the European Miriam, is dressed as in a more Italian countryside type of costume. And a year before, Cassatt had attempted, now lost, a painting called Mariana in the Moated Grange, which was based on a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. So unfortunately we don't have that, but clearly she and her entire family were highly literate, and I think in seeking to place her work at the Paris Salon would have wanted to be perceived as such. So for the and I think here you see how she's using even, the reason I have the Courbet here is just, again, that intensity of the two faces, in this case, the two lovers that are interlocked there. But for the remainder of our time, I did want to spend some time and delve into that friendship that Cassatt forged with another American woman she met in Paris in March of 1874. And we have Cassatt's traveling companion and friend, Emily Sartain, to thank for describing the first interaction of their meeting this group of women. These are the elder sisters. So I'm quoting from Emily's letter to her father in 1874. "Madame de Sartre has an accession to her family in the person of the two Miss Elders," so only two of them could fit there at this pensione. "They are very nice and very pretty," and they she ends up going on to talk about how they were lucky enough to have a footman to drive them around. Well, these three, this is, as you see there, Louisine, who's going to become part of our story, and also important, Anne and Adeline there on either side of her, the two sisters on either side. They were in Paris. Their mother had taken them there after their father had died as really a way of sort of providing them with the finishing education that she felt they needed. But their finances were not, they were comfortable but not robust, let's say. They did have an allowance. And so what Louisine, when she met for the first time This is what she had to say about Cassatt. So the woman we're talking about is here at the far left. And writing about Cassatt, quote, "She was very kind to me, showing me the splendid things in the great city, making them still more splendid by opening my eyes to see their beauty through her own knowledge and appreciation. I felt then that Miss Cassatt was the most intelligent woman I had ever met. It seemed to me no one could see any more understandingly, feel it more deeply, or express themselves more clearly than she did," unquote. So she and Cassatt, Louisine and Cassatt, later Louisine Havemeyer, would become close friends and remain in contact for over 50 years until Cassatt's death in 1926. And for Cassatt, at the outset, it may well be, and I suspect it was, that the relationship was quite strategic in that she found a willing student of avant-garde French art who could fulfill her dreams of fame and fortune. And remember, I think as an American living in France, she, as Eliza Haldeman said, the Americans were after money, but the French were after fame. I think she living in France was probably after both, as it played out in the Modern Woman mural. And just to remind you, this we've never found a source for in the Japanese prints. So if you also ever see any image that looks like the young girls pursuing fame, it's quite an unusual scene. It doesn't appear, as far as we know, in any other examples in 19th century or earlier kinds of art. And you see them as this young girl is almost in the apotheosis into the sky as part of the Modern Woman mural. So here is this is the self-portrait Mary Cassatt painted close to the time when she and Louisine would have first met in 1878, and it was originally in Louisine's collection, and then left the collection and came yet back to the Metropolitan, fortunately, so that you can see it today. So Havemeyer sampled Cassatt's passion for Parisian culture. She became fascinated with and indoctrinated by, especially her passion for contemporary French painters, and most especially the work of Degas. And I wanted to just quote from you, it's on your handout there, but Louisine was one of the few collectors who ever took the time to write her memoirs, and we do get a lot of our information about Degas and other artists, and even Cassatt, in that version that you have on your handout from the 1993 Ursus Press. And the reason I mention that, because she was so close to Cassatt that when the memoirs were published initially privately by the family after Louisine's death, the Cassatt chapter was not published then. It was still only in manuscript form, but at the time of 1993, when the Metropolitan mounted the splendid legacy show about the Havemeyer collection, Ursus Press stepped up and said, now's the time, we should really publish that longer chapter about Cassatt. So that's why I refer you to that one. But here we're going to quote about their meeting, of her meeting of, or learning about Degas, and I quote from Louisine, 16 to 60. "I was about 16 years old when I first heard of Degas, of course through Miss Cassatt. She took me to see one of his pastels and advised me to buy it. How well I remember going with her to the color shop where it was for sale. The pastel was Répétition de ballet. It was so new and strange to me. I scarce knew how to appreciate it, or whether I liked it or not, for I believe it takes special brain cells to understand Degas. There was nothing the matter with Miss Cassatt's brain cells, however, and I bought it on her advice." And I'm showing you just very early on panel oil by Cassatt, this head of a young woman, a young girl, and the background of this was the work that Louisine bought. As a 19-year-old, she had to borrow from her two sisters, so those two other philanthropists you saw earlier, they helped her put together the $100 she needed to buy this painting. I say painting, it's, as you see, gouache and pastel over monotype. The first work ever brought to this country by Degas, and also the first work any American ever purchased of the work of Degas. And Louisine also goes on in her memoirs to say, well, I had to suffer many privations to pay back my sisters to afford this work. But she said she was extremely pleased when Cassatt informed her that Degas had really needed the money at that time. And so, again, as a teenager, she was really beginning her way forward to assemble what would become later on one of the most important collections ever put together of the work of Degas. But to turn back to Cassatt, this very important and I think productive and tumultuous relationship between Cassatt and Degas, I'm sure will again be taken up throughout the course. In many ways, I would just note at the outset that I think what probably to me hasn't been delved into enough about these two and why they became so closely connected. People often forget that Degas' mother was actually an American, a Creole from New Orleans. He comes over to paint, and many of you know his scenes of the New Orleans cotton brokers' offices. But again, how would he have been attracted to another American working in Paris? I think it's probably the case that even if it was, whether it was conscious or unconscious, but his mother had actually been American, although Creole. So this artistic relationship between Degas and Cassatt has been, I think, really well and thoroughly explored by Kimberly Jones at the National Gallery. It should be on your handout there. A wonderful exhibition of 2014. And we, Eric and I, had the great fortune to contribute to that. And I just mentioned that it began really with Kimberly's investigation of this painting, Cassatt's Little Girl in a Blue Armchair, because it was said through various reports and its surviving documents that Degas had repainted this part of the background here. And when they investigated under the conservation notes and all of that, saw that how really it revealed how the changes really affected this work. So I refer you with all the best, very heartily, to the excellent work in that catalog about the conservation of this work. But we do know, certainly, Degas and Cassatt were very familiar with one another in those years. There was a great deal of call and response. And again, I wanted to think about works in our collection. Here we have at the left his At the Races, and you see his scene much more in that mode of thinking about the modernity of the photographic image, the way those horses are really sliced and severed at the right edge there, or think about how the horses running in the race course in the far distance are much smaller. They're appearing with their legs flying in both forward and backwards as though they're almost rocking horses. This is before really Muybridge is doing, well, he's doing those photographs, but Degas hasn't adopted that yet into his own work, so they appear, we call it the sort of rocking horse look. And yet how Cassatt, when she takes on the scene of driving, which is, you can go see it at the Philadelphia Museum, this is actually Degas' little niece here posed in the front of the carriage, so closely connected, not just by theme, but actually by the model. And yet she is much more interested in, this is her sister Lydia at the helm here, directing the carriage. The groom is really of no interest, it seems, to Cassatt, just seated there at the back. And it's really much more about that transition or that journey from the little girl, the sort of girl in the front of the carriage, to womanhood and sort of driving there at the helm of this carriage. And so Cassatt happened to be actually as well a very accomplished equestrian, and you'll see, and her brother Alec had a number of racehorses, so the equestrian world was something quite familiar to her as it was for Degas. Also, call and response, and I, of course, wanted to use our own visit to a museum. These all modeled on Cassatt. Here's Cassatt's own work of this same period when she, Degas, and Camille Pizarro were all collaborating. I'm sure, again, you're going to hear this throughout the course on their work of experimental avant-garde printmaking in black and white for a journal they were working on called Day and Night, Le Jour et la Nuit. Using aqua tints in very experimental ways. And all of this work for Cassatt is going to play into her later really monumental series of the color aqua tints of that series of 25. But here, and you see Degas using the soft ground as he's modeling Cassatt from the back, leaning on her parasol, and here, presumably, is her sister Lydia with the nose in the guidebook. And we do know Cassatt posed for him quite regularly, Degas writes a lot about this immersive style of portraiture that he was after. It was about spending time with people, watching them go about their daily lives. And when he would have models come to the studio, he felt they couldn't, Cassatt writes that they couldn't capture what it was he was after. In that particular, she was always known to be quite elegant, and you see her here, that nonchalance, almost that sort of Italian sense of sprezzatura as she's leaning on her parasol, something he's capturing. Whereas in our MFA scene, showing her again, here's Lydia with the, studying carefully. We appreciate the fact that she's reading all of her art history as she's studying her painting. But there you see Cassatt with the hand on the hip. That was also becoming a symbol for the modern woman, the independent woman. And she's there really just taking in the work as she enjoys the gallery, presumably at the Louvre, where he was proposing them earlier in the prints. In this one, I love the contre-jour. It's maybe not one of her absolute best prints, but you see here how she's playing with the light coming through the different shapes and forms with these two figures in this very evocative kind of interior. So a very highly accomplished printmaker, and certainly in the world of Pissarro and Degas, could very much hold her own and surpass them as well in the realm of the color prints, which is what we're going to come to now. And here, this is something I had mentioned to you I had worked on when we did a Works on Paper show at the Met by Cassatt Works on Paper to complement the Modern Woman show that traveled there. And the reason I wanted to bring these out, and I'm sure, again, you're going to be hearing about them more in the rest of the course, is that often we don't think of them as the integral series, as a series that unfolds for you. So the reason I've set them up this way is that this was the first, we know this was the first one of this series of color aqua tints she embarked upon. It required 17 different states to achieve this one, the bath. So I think in a way she included it with the set, but I always think of it as something a bit specialized as she was working out her method and ideas. And so that really leaves 9, and I don't have these quite set up the way I want. I may change them, but if you think of these, first let's think of the 8 together here, and if you think of them as a suite, she's really focusing on 2 different models. One model looks even a bit Japanesque, a bit Asian here. You see her with these sort of orientalized, perhaps, features. And here, we've met her earlier, is the redhead. So take a look at what she's doing in terms of creating these times of day in 2 different women's lives. And this was something that did appear quite frequently in the portfolios of Japanese prints, where they were taking on the world of the courtesans and showing them as they went about their lives. So we have a mother with a baby from the back, from a bit more of the front. We have her traveling in the realm of the city and public space here in the omnibus with a nurse and her child. And then you have her in the private space of her own home, presumably writing at a desk. And we actually own this desk at the MFA Boston, the very desk Cassatt had in her home, and it was in the wing, the Art of the Americas wing installation when we opened. So what do we have here with the redhead? We have her from the back, reflected from the front. I mentioned before this sort of semi-private public space of the dressmaker's fitting room, and here you have her in her interior. And then you have them together, intertwined in terms of serving tea and that sense of their coming together, these 2 worlds of these 2 different women. Now, we can continue to unpack these, but I just want to put this out here because, again, I think we often see these prints individually, but that Cassatt is layering in to these, to something that she very deliberately spent a good deal of time, 25 impressions of each of these, multiple states. One took as many as 17. Many of them took at least 6, 8, and 10 states to produce. So we're talking many, many impressions to create the series you see here. There's the first. Here you see them back, a bit front, and set up there. And here you see back, front, and again set up there. These were all also feeding into her thinking about the modern woman mural. You've met this before. The young girls pursuing fame. In the center, women harvesting from the apple trees as taking, in the modern Eve sense, the fruits of knowledge and gathering them up. And on the far right, these are women learning and practicing the arts. This is actually something Wanda Korn identified. She's holding up her skirt there. It's a form of skirt dancing that was practiced in American colleges, women's colleges. And you've met, and you'll see here, oh, sorry, here's the Utamaro. This was the print that I was able to find at the Metropolitan's collection of their plucking the fruit from the trees that inspired the central scene. And Utamaro himself set these up as large three-scale triptychs, three-print triptychs. So again, she's using something on a small scale that she's then enlarging to make really a grand statement. And you met these two decorative painters, the decorative Puvis, and take a look at his work over at the Boston Public Library murals as well when you're there next. And here is Gauguin's, our own great painting here, where you see the central figure focusing on plucking that apple from the fruit of knowledge, or in the sort of this paradise that he's found in Tahiti, much further afield. So the imaginary one of the ancient world, the modern world of Tahiti. Here you see it again. And please keep an eye out. I do hope we find this one day. Here's our own banjo and a study in pastel for this group here. And it's a little bit hard to see, but the woman seated on the ground with one playing the banjo. And the banjo at that time was also a relatively, for women, a new type of instrument that was being introduced on college campuses for women. It was intended to be something that they would perform and practice, and were greatly admired for their skill at playing the banjo. So she's very distinctively choosing an American instrument, although it does resemble the Japanese instruments that appear frequently in the Japanese prints. But just to show you where her work was situated amongst her contemporaries, much earlier, Gustave Courbet was showing women at their dressing table. So she certainly could have known this work or ones like it. But yet Cassatt, when she's rendering the figure with the dressing gown all the way down to really the base of her spine, when Degas saw this print, he is reported to have said, "I don't believe that a woman can draw a back like that." Well, look what he provided in his monotypes. These are earlier, but he did similar ones later on. And I do think even her contemporaries in Paris, thinking of someone like Toulouse-Lautrec, who was a very accomplished printmaker working in a slightly different mode in lithography, when he gets around to showing his woman in front of this wash basin, and you see her reflected in the mirror here, he's actually inserted one of the more erotic Utamaro prints over the wash basin. So he's making every allusion to sort of the French brothel. So a very different space than the one that Cassatt was portraying in her prints, even though, you know, she might have been alluding to the sensuality of that red-headed model, one of her favorites. I think here you get a feel for the older woman, perhaps much more a part of that brothel world that Degas was interested in. So we come to Degas' painting of his own portrait of Cassatt. And remember when I said to pay attention to that bow early on in her portrait, photographic portrait of 1867. Here you see he's quite true to the kind of costume she did like to wear, and the hats. She never cared for this portrait at all. She felt it was completely inappropriate. And I think when we begin to unpack this, one of the reasons I think that she would have really found it abhorrent was that it was initially thought that she was holding trade cards here. So she was holding out, we know she's holding out these cards. Early on it was thought that they were tarot cards, perhaps a fortune teller type of mode. But I think when we were talking with Kimberly Jones, And I was looking at this carefully in Washington, D.C. It's a little bit easier to see in person. These look to me to be photographs of works that perhaps are for sale. And that this one especially looks almost like a drinker holding up something when you see it from the other way around. And so Cassatt's role as a promoter of artists' work, not just of Degas' work, as you've heard, but many, providing all kinds of, becoming really the agent for the Haussmanns in 1889. And again, I think you're going to be hearing more about that as we go along with the course. This was something that she really did, and in a way, as Eric and I spoke about in the catalog for Degas Cassatt, as a strategy of promoting herself as an artist. So if she could get the collectors to buy the work of Degas, often they would go along and acquire some of her works as well along the way. And in the case of Degas, that was very much true for the Haussmanns. So when Louisine married her husband, Harry Haussmann, he was the mastermind of what was called the Sugar Trust, the second trust in the United States. They married in 1883, and let's just say her resources went well beyond those of her two sisters' allowances. So together, they were able to assemble one of the certainly most comprehensive private collections. Now, of course, it's public at the Metropolitan. They purchased 64 paintings, pastels, drawings, and fans, 70 bronzes. In fact, it was Louisine who went back after Degas' death with Cassatt to see about the casting of the bronzes, including this one in the center in our collection at the MFA and at the Met, the 14-year-old dancer, which appeared in the Impressionist exhibition of 1881, and many, as you see, of works in other media, and I just show a couple here. Early on, Louisine had relied very much on Cassatt's advice, as you heard, as a teenager, but as time went on, she was much more independent. And here you see dancers practicing at the bar. She purchased this after her husband died and set a record price at the New York auction. She was living in New York. Of course, Cassatt was living in Paris at that time, and they hadn't really communicated about it. She was working solely with the dealer for Degas, Durand Ruel, who was bidding on her behalf. And when Degas heard about the record price and was asked what he thought about it, he said he felt like a racehorse who had just won the Grand Prix but had nothing to show for it but his oats. And I love that because he spent a lot of time at racetracks. She also went after this work on the right, The Woman in a Shallow Tub, and you'll hear a lot more about that in the Degas Cassatt catalog because this was formerly owned by Cassatt when they had exchanged works. So when Louisine died in 1929, she had selected a specific group of works for the Metropolitan and some others that her children would choose from. And at that time, her three children, she had two daughters and a son, decided to open up the collection entirely, carte blanche, to the Metropolitan Museum's curators. I think it's a fascinating story to see what the curators took and what they did not. So the young mother sewing, you've seen before, one of the icons of the Met's collection, that was one they took. But remember, Mary Cassatt was not really, at that time in 1929, something major. Maybe they felt they had enough or they were picking enough. So they let this one go on the right, the girl arranging her hair. This was actually, it should say on it, and I will add for the next caption, this was the one that Cassatt and Degas exchanged. So this was the Cassatt that Degas owned. And I'm sure you'll be hearing about that as well later in the course. This is now, as you see, in the Chester Dale collection. So it got away. They didn't think, perhaps it was considered too ugly or something in 1929. But in any event, didn't make it to the Met's collection. She did do a number of these family portraits in 1895 on paper. This one I mentioned because I think this is very much thanks to our philanthropist, a story of women. So these are two women collectors, and I think it's fascinating that Cassatt, in all of the painting images of mothers and daughters, she rarely actually ever portrayed real life mothers and daughters, and here she did. And yet, at this age, I think she understood this young woman, Electra Havemeyer, the youngest daughter of Louisine. She was going to be the collector, and she is the founder of Shelburne Museum in Vermont, which is an outdoor museum for a variety of things, including the core of the Havemeyer paintings and collections, and including the 14-year-old dancer initially that sadly had to be deaccessioned as there were so many impressions of it in public collections to continue the museum. But here you see also Louisine appearing in the collection at Shelburne that was founded by Electra. And I couldn't resist bringing this along because I started in this place, and I thought at the end of the time when I was working on the talk, I would put it at the end here for just something for you to think about, because we often really think of Cassatt as being, and she did spend, of course, most of her years abroad, and yet, like Sartain in many ways, she retained a sense of Americanness. This portrait, it should say, at the Metropolitan, it's Mrs. Riddle, was her mother, Catherine Cassatt's first cousin. And as a thank you to her mother's cousin, who had given the family this Canton tea set, Cassatt painted her portrait. Unfortunately, Mrs. Riddle detested the portrait. And so it sat in Cassatt's closet until Louisine, visiting Cassatt in her older years in the teens in just before the war in 1914, looked at her works, wanted to go through them, and said, well, this is a wonderful portrait. You really ought to think about showing it, which she did. She showed it in Paris, and then she showed it subsequently in Knoedler's in New York at a show of Impressionists there. And it became the first gift by the artist, by Mary Cassatt, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So there it is. But I do think she is very much thinking about our own kinds of portraiture here in Boston and the kinds of American portraiture she would have known. There, you're going to hear more from Paul Fisher about Louisine's later life, where she collaborated with Cassatt in 1915 in mounting a major exhibition to support women's suffrage at Knoedler's in New York. And I think Louisine, her husband had already been dead in 1907, so she was doing this as a solo player in those years. But she learned very clearly who her friends were and who they were not, in terms of those who would lend to a show that was for women's suffrage and those who would not, including Colonel Oliver Payne, who actually was given half of their house in New York to live in. He would not lend any of the work that Cassatt had assembled for him, Degas or Cassatt or anyone else, to this exhibition right in Manhattan. So it was quite an eye-opener. I hope you'll hear more. There she is speaking in New York. And I do want to end here the image of herself as she was shown, as she thought of herself in 1878, and as Degas portrayed her. She's an extraordinary person. I hope you all will stay with us as we continue to unpack and explore her career throughout the work of my colleagues, Erica Hirschler, Nancy Moe Matthews, and Paul Fisher. And I thank you all for being such an attentive audience today. And I think we have time for some questions.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions.
We have time for a few questions, so we're happy to, if anyone has any further questions, just raise your hand, and Kristen has the microphone, so she'll...
Lauren has one on the other side.
Here's
It's coming
one.
your way.
Okay, Lauren's got one. Thanks, Lauren. Didn't see you there. Thanks, Lauren.
Do you know on the portraits where there's a range of years, is that predominantly because we don't know the date that the portrait was done or the picture, or is that because they actively worked on it in that range?
That's a great question. So in this case, it's that they actively worked on it. And in fact, we know from Louisine's memoirs that they actually had to extract from Degas' studio many of his works because he kept working on them. So this is the case of the fallen jockey, the woman with the chrysanthemums, and in one case, he tried to get a higher payment as time went on. And the Havenmeyers had negotiated a particular price for work, and over the years of working on it, he felt he was owed more. So this worked in a variety of ways, but many artists do come back and keep working, so that's why. Thank you, great question. Anyone else out there? I see someone raising a hand. There we go, Lauren. Thank you.
When you spoke about our painting of the tea, you talked about the visitor with the teacup. Mm-hmm. And I had heard that Lydia was the other person. Is that
yes.
true? Is that true?
It looks like Lydia to me too, and I think I would say that's accurate. Well, we're going to leave Erica to talk about that one, I think, next week.
Okay. Great.
But I would say it's fine to say it's Lydia.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, yes, right up front here. Would you like the microphone? It's coming your way.
So did she actually support herself through her art, or was it, her friends supporting her, buying her paper? Did it become a career for her?
She definitely supported herself. She showed actively at Durand Ruel, at Knoedler's. The set of the 10 color prints was initially shown at Durand Ruel in Paris, and Louisine was the first to buy those as well. So she, and through her, there's a young woman, Laura Corey, working on Cassatt's actual work with Durand Ruel. It doesn't appear that she was paid through Durand Ruel for placing, and she did have certainly the sense that these collections needed to be formed here in the United States and worked tirelessly to do so. But I think in many ways, as Eric and I argued in the essay for the Degas Cassatt catalog, she was being paid in the way that it was promoting herself and her work through all of these contacts. But she definitely supported herself. She supported her parents, and her parents eventually come over to Paris to live with her, along with her sister Lydia. Her brother Alexander was a prominent figure, businessman running the railroad back in the United States, so he was well on his way, but the others did come and stay with her. So she had a fairly large operation to support in Paris. She owned a chateau there outside of Paris, and that was where she had the large space where she could actually paint the modern woman mural, which were oils on canvas, much like our own Sargent murals here, where they could be rolled and then shipped and transported to Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition. So she had an enormous barn or building where she could lower and raise to get up on a scaffold to paint that enormous canvas of the modern woman. So she was, right from the beginning, I think when she sought out those copies for the Archbishop of Pittsburgh, she was always thinking the prints might also further her work in Night and Day as a journal. She thought she could be better known if she disseminated her work through the printmaking medium and connected with Degas and Pissarro to do that. And I think she was always thinking that way. As so many artists who have to make a way, they have to turn to other formats in which to promote their own work. So she did it through exhibition, printmaking, sponsoring many collectors, and in any combination thereof. Great question. Yes, one more.
When you first mentioned her series of dry point and
yes, her color prints.
you said that this had never been done before. Were you referring to the fact that she made so many impressions of it?
I think never been done before to this level. So the question was about my saying that they had never been done before as this series of such an intensely focused series with that amount of color in that many impressions. I mean, I don't know of any other that I could bring to you and name as an American artist. And at the Met, I really had worked extensively. I covered American, British, and contemporary works on paper. So I can't think of anyone else I could bring to you who had really immersed that much. And she did work with a professional printer. Monsieur Leroy is all we know. He's actually, when she signed the plates, she signed it Mary Cassatt, printed with Monsieur Leroy. So he was well known. It was very much like a sculptor working with a particular foundry to produce a series of sculptures, let's say. But they are extraordinary, and I think when you see them one-off, you don't think of really the whole, and that's why I wanted to bring them today to you. I think you'll be seeing them and unpacking them further with, I hope, Nancy, because she's really a great, great scholar of the Cassatt prints. Well, thank you all. I hope you keep coming, and it's great to have you here for this inaugural session.